In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and discovered the Americas. Though he believed he had reached the Indies, what he had stumbled upon was far more significant. A massive and largely unknown continent teeming with life, natural resources, and civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. This single voyage would trigger a series of events that would shape the course of global history forever. The arrival of Columbus marked the beginning of an era that brought great exploration, immense opportunity, but also unimaginable suffering. In the pursuit of power and territory, millions would die. Empires would rise and fall. And on the ashes of conflict, a new nation would eventually be born on July 4, 1776, the United States of America. Since its founding, the United States has grown to become the most dominant force in the modern world, conquering not just territory, but ideas, industries, and influence. Its military is unmatched. Its cultural exports reach every corner of the globe. Its technological advances have revolutionized how we live, communicate, and even think. For many, it has become the modern Roman Empire, not in its territorial ambition, but in its reach, its wealth, and its defining power. Yet, in the shadows of this success lies a deeper, more complex origin story, a history of how it all began. A story not of a single man or one voyage, but of centuries of exploration, war, displacement, and reinvention. To understand this land fully, one must look long before 1776, long before Columbus, back to a time when the Americas were already alive with civilization. Before European colonization ever reached the shores of North America, the land was home to a wide and diverse group of Native American peoples. These societies had built complex structures of governance, religion, trade, and diplomacy. They had mastered agriculture, astronomy, hunting, architecture, and spiritual life. Some tribes lived nomadic lives, while others, such as the Mississippians, built massive urban centers complete with temples, mounds, and organized leadership. Hundreds of thousands of people lived across this vast continent, governing specific regions, forming alliances, fighting wars, making peace, and thriving for thousands of years. When the first European explorers began to arrive in the 15th century, they did not arrive at a blank slate. They arrived at a place that had long been inhabited, cultivated, and defended. The continent, rich in forests, rivers, minerals, and wildlife, called out to those across the ocean who were eager to explore and conquer. Long before Columbus, a Norse navigator named Leif Erikson had sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000 CE. Guided by the accounts of another Norseman, Jarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course and had sighted a new land, Erikson set out across the Labrador Sea. He eventually reached what we now believe to be Newfoundland, establishing a small settlement called El Anse aux Meadows. This site, along with a few other outposts, marked the first known European attempt at settlement in North America. However, these Norse efforts were short-lived. Within 2 decades, the settlements were abandoned and Europe largely forgot about the land to the west. It would take nearly 500 more years before Europeans returned to North America in significant numbers. In the 15th century, European nations were driven by a desire for wealth, trade, and new maritime routes, especially to India and Asia. Ships were being built stronger and faster, navigational instruments were improving, and ambitious monarchs were ready to fund expeditions that promised land and riches. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands became locked in a fierce competition to dominate global trade and exploration. In this race, Christopher Columbus, an Italian sailing under the Spanish flag, embarked on his now famous journey in 1492. Though he landed in the Bahamas and explored parts of the Caribbean, his voyage opened the door to what would soon be referred to as the New World, a term later popularized by Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, for whom the Americas were named. As news of Columbus' discoveries spread, Waves of explorers, adventurers, and conquerors followed. The Spanish quickly moved into the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. But soon their gaze, along with that of their European rivals, shifted northward. In 1497, Giovanni Caboto, known in English as John Cabot, sailed under the English flag and reached the shores of Newfoundland, unknowingly treading the same ground Leif Erikson had nearly 500 years earlier. Cabot's voyage gave England a claim to North America, one they would later use to justify colonial ambitions along the eastern seaboard. At the same time, French explorers such as Jacques Cartier began mapping the St. Lawrence River, while Giovanni de Verrazano charted much of the Atlantic coast for France. Spain continued its efforts in the south. Juan Ponce de Leon explored Florida. Bolivar and his Cabeza de Vaca ventured through the American Southwest. Hernando de Soto traveled deep into what is now the southeastern United States. These early explorers laid the groundwork for what would become fierce European colonization. By the dawn of the 17th century, the map of North America was being rapidly redrawn. The English established permanent colonies such as Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. The French expanded their influence along the Mississippi River and in modern-day Canada. The Spanish entrenched their power in Florida, Texas, New Mexico, and California. Even the Dutch and the Swedes attempted colonies, though many were short-lived. The drive behind colonization was rooted in the promise of land, resources, and wealth, but it was also framed through a religious and moral lens. European powers believed they were bringing civilization, Christianity, and order to a so-called savage world. In reality, this civilization often came through the sword. Native peoples were displaced, enslaved, and slaughtered. Entire cultures were wiped out through disease, war, and forced assimilation. What began as exploration had quickly turned into conquest. Despite this violent foundation, European settlements grew rapidly. Cities were founded, trade routes developed, and economic systems, especially those built around agriculture and slave labor, began to thrive. The Atlantic slave trade became one of the darkest chapters in the developing New World. Millions of Africans were captured, transported, and sold into slavery. They were forced to labor under brutal conditions, building the foundations of what would become some of the richest economies in the Western Hemisphere. The legacy of slavery, displacement, and colonization would shape the social and racial structures of the Americas for centuries. Yet, within this complex, brutal, and expansive history, something new began to form, an identity separate from the old European world. The colonies, while originally loyal to their mother countries, started developing their own culture, economy, and political philosophy. Enlightenment ideas, growing frustration with taxation, and the desire for self-governance led to revolution. In 1776, representatives from 13 colonies declared independence from the British Crown, giving birth to the United States of America. What followed was a war, a constitution, and the establishment of a republic unlike any the world had seen. Built on ideals of liberty, justice, and democracy. However imperfectly applied, the United States became a symbol of what was possible when people took control of their destiny. In the centuries that followed, the United States would grow from a fragile collection of rebellious colonies to a global superpower. Its influence would extend to every continent, every ocean, and every sphere of life, military, economic, technological, and cultural. From the defeat of empires in 2 world wars to the space race and the digital revolution, the story of America became the story of modern progress and modern conflict. But to understand its rise, its strength, and its contradictions, we must never forget how it all began. With lands that were once wild and sacred, people who lived in harmony with nature, and a wave of ships that brought both opportunity and tragedy. This is the story of the Americas, the story of conquest and resistance, of destruction and creation, and ultimately, the story of a nation that continues to define the world we live in today. The Declaration of Independence marked a new era not just for America, but for the world. The formation of a republic based on principles of liberty and representation was a revolutionary idea in a world still dominated by monarchs and empires. But the road to nationhood was anything but smooth. The Revolutionary War was long and brutal. The young colonies were under-equipped and outnumbered, facing the might of the British Empire. Yet, with determination, strategy, and the support of foreign allies like France, they secured victory. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially ended the war, and the United States was recognized as an independent nation. With freedom came the challenge of governance. The founders crafted the U.S. Constitution in 1787, a remarkable document that balanced power among three branches of government and granted certain rights to its citizens. However, it also reflected the contradictions of the time. While the Constitution spoke of liberty and justice, it was written in a country where slavery was legal, where Native American lands were being seized, and where only property-owning white men could vote. These contradictions would remain unresolved for generations and would ignite future conflicts. In the decades that followed, the United States began to expand westward at a rapid pace. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the country. Explorers like Lewis and Clark charted new territories, while settlers poured west in search of land and opportunity. This era of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand from coast to coast, drove policy and population alike. But expansion came at a great cost. Native American tribes were forcibly removed from their lands. Treaties were made and broken. Wars were fought. One of the darkest moments was the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Native Americans died during forced relocations. As the country grew, so did its economy. The Industrial Revolution brought machines, factories, and a shift from rural to urban life. Railroads stitched the country together. Steam power transformed transportation. Immigration from Europe surged. Millions arrived in search of a better life. And though they faced hardship, they contributed greatly to the development of American industry and society. But not all was progress. In the southern states, slavery remained a brutal reality, fueling a booming cotton economy. The moral, political, and economic tensions between the North and South deepened until they erupted into the most devastating conflict in American history, the Civil War. In 1861, 11 southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. President Abraham Lincoln, committed to preserving the Union and ending the expansion of slavery, led the country through 4 years of brutal warfare. Over 600,000 lives were lost. The war tore families apart, razed cities, and shook the foundation of the Republic. In 1865, the Union emerged victorious. Slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. Lincoln, who had delivered the Emancipation Proclamation, was assassinated just days after the war ended. The nation entered a period of reconstruction, attempting to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society. But this effort faced violent resistance, and while some progress was made, true equality remained elusive. The late 19th century saw America rapidly transform. The Gilded Age brought enormous wealth for some, with titans of industry like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt shaping finance, steel, and transportation. But this wealth was concentrated, and working-class Americans often toiled in dangerous conditions for little pay. Labor unions began to rise. Strikes and protests became common. At the same time, America's expansion continued overseas. The Spanish-American War in 1898 resulted in U.S. control of territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, marking the beginning of America's overseas empire. As the 20th century dawned, America stood at a crossroads. It had emerged as a powerful industrial nation, yet deep divides remained. The First World War tested the nation's strength abroad. Though the US joined the war late, its involvement was decisive. After the war ended in 1918, America experienced a period of cultural transformation, the Roaring Twenties. Jazz, cinema, radio, and consumerism defined the era. But it all came crashing down in 1929 with the stock market crash. The Great Depression that followed plunged the country into economic despair. Millions were unemployed. Breadlines formed. Families lost homes. President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with the New Deal, a series of government programs designed to revive the economy and restore public trust. Just as America began to recover, the world was thrust into the Second World War. In 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. entered the war against the Axis powers. The country mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Factories were converted to produce weapons and aircraft. Millions joined the armed forces. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. By 1945, with the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan, the United States emerged not only victorious, but as a true superpower. It was now a nuclear, armed giant, one of two dominant powers in the world alongside the Soviet Union. The Cold War defined the second half of the 20th century. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a decades-long struggle for global influence, ideological, technological, and military. Proxy wars were fought in Korea and Vietnam. A space race captivated the world, culminating in 1969 when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Domestically, America faced a civil rights reckoning. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks fought to end racial segregation and injustice. Legislation was passed, marches were held, and although progress was made, the struggle for equality and justice remained ongoing. In the closing decades of the 20th century, America saw both triumph and turmoil. The fall of the Berlin Wall and collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War and left the United States as the world's lone superpower. The economy boomed in the 1990s, driven by technology and innovation. The internet revolutionized life across the globe, yet the new century began with tragedy. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on American soil shocked the nation and the world. The response was swift. Wars were launched in Afghanistan and Iraq, reshaping U.S. foreign policy for decades to come. Today, the United States remains a global leader, economically, militarily, scientifically, and culturally. Its influence touches every continent. Its innovations continue to shape the future, yet its challenges are also profound. Political division, social unrest, economic inequality, environmental crises, and questions of identity and unity all test the strength of the Republic. Just as in the past, the nation faces a choice: to evolve, to confront its flaws, and to pursue the ideals upon which it was founded, or to repeat the mistakes of history. This is the story of a land discovered in 1492, fought over for centuries, and born anew in 1776. It is a story of explorers and visionaries, of enslaved people and freedom fighters, of builders and dreamers. It is a story filled with contradiction. Freedom built on oppression, wealth built on suffering, hope built through hardship. And yet, it is a story still being written, chapter by chapter, by the people who live it. The story of America is not simply one of triumph or tragedy. It is both. It is a story of unshakable ambition and devastating consequences, of vision and violence, of hope and hardship. From the native peoples who first walked these lands, to the explorers who crossed oceans, to the generations who built, fought, struggled, and dreamed, this land has witnessed the full spectrum of the human experience. The United States did not rise overnight. It was forged in conflict, tested by time, and shaped by the hands of millions. And though it stands today as a symbol of power and progress, its future is not guaranteed by its past. Every great nation must ask itself, what comes next? Will the promise of liberty and justice for all finally be realized? Can the lessons of history prevent the mistakes of tomorrow? The answers lie not in monuments or documents, but in the people, those who refuse to forget where they came from, those who are brave enough to challenge what is and bold enough to imagine what could be. So, as we reflect on this incredible journey, from the first footsteps on native soil to the roar of rockets reaching into space, we must remember, history is not finished. It is being written every day, and each of us, in our own way, holds the pen. May we write it wisely. If you found this journey through history insightful and thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we dive deep into the past to understand the present and uncover the stories that shaped our world. Your support helps us bring more powerful content, more untold histories, and more perspectives that matter. So hit the like button, share this video with others who love history, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching. And remember, history isn't just something we study. It's something we carry forward.